This is CNN Breaking News.
I'm Carol Costello. We'd like to welcome our international viewers from around the world, because we do have important breaking news to pass along to all of you. Private first class, or at least he used to be, Bradley Manning has been sentenced now. A military judge said she would announce his sentence today, and she has. He's been sentenced to 35 years behind bars, and of course he's been dishonorably discharged. Chris Lawrence is inside the military courtroom at Fort Meade, Maryland. When he's able to get out, he'll bring us a full report, but there you see it. Bradley Manning sentenced to 35 years in prison and dishonorably discharged. Defense attorney Page Pate is here to talk more about the sentencing. Welcome, Page.
Good morning.
So prosecutors wanted 60 years. He got 35. Did the judge take into account Manning's youth?
I think so. The prosecutors had been asking for 60 years. They wanted to send a message that if you leak this type of information, we're going to catch you and we're going to punish you. Remember, he could have faced up to 90 years in prison for this type of an offense. So I think the judge considered his age. I think the judge also took into account the fact that he seemed to apologize, not so much for what he did, but for the harm that it may have caused to the country.
Well, in the pre-sentencing hearing, I guess I'll call it that, because I don't know the correct terminology to use in a military court, but Bradley Manning's attorneys presented all of this evidence of what happened in his childhood. He had a terribly tortured childhood, and they intimated that perhaps the Army should have known about his problems and not, you know, and not given him such access to sensitive information.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. So would the judge
position.
take that into account too?
You know, somewhat, and I think they walked a fine line. You really can't say, let's blame the military for putting him in the position that they did. But at the same time, they wanted to show to the judge that, look, you know, this kid has some problems. And what he did, he thought was right. He was acting out of at least the best interest in his heart. And so he wasn't trying to maliciously harm the country. He wasn't trying to aid the enemy. And of course, she found that that charge was not going to go forward, and she found him not guilty of that charge. So I think she took all of that into consideration in imposing this sentence.
And I believe in military courts that the Army can review the sentencing.
Absolutely.
And can actually, and then what could happen? Could it get even less?
Within 6 months, it goes to an Army Court of Appeals, just like in regular civilian court. They can review both the conviction itself and the sentence. Now here, remember, Manning pled guilty to some of these offenses. So really, the judge's finding of guilt only applies to certain of the charges, which would go up on appeal.
Yeah. It is interesting to me that he only got, I say that, only 35 years. In light of Edward Snowden, you would have thought that that might enter into the judge's decision as well.
I think it's clear that the government's request for such a lengthy sentence had a lot to do with Edward Snowden. I think they're trying to send a message that if you do something like this, if you leak information, whether it harms the country or not, and we catch you, we're going to impose some stiff punishment. But 35 years is still excessive. If you look back in the past at other cases like this, I know this is supposed to be the largest leak of its kind, but other folks who have given information to the Soviet Union back in the 80s, 30 years was a maximum back then. We've seen people sentenced to only months in the brig for this type of an offense.
Interesting. Page Pate, thank you very much. Chris Lawrence still trapped in that courtroom at Fort Meade. When he gets out, of course, we'll take you live to Maryland. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with much more in the newsroom.